Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. I know we have people joining in from different parts of the country. We welcome you all to the Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations panel discussion on writing NIH grants. We have done a couple of these sessions already. The first one was on writing the abstract and specific aims section. We did one session on background sections of NIH grant applications. And now today we're going to be focusing on the approach section. And with the mind towards tobacco regulatory science related proposals. If you have not attended the previous sessions, we welcome you to go to our website, the TCOR's website at U of M, Yale, Georgetown University, BC Cancer. I think Molly can put in the link and view the previous sessions if you would like to see what we covered there. So today's agenda is, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming today, and I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have three amazing panelists that have generously agreed to be here today to share their points of view. And the panelists will provide general advice about how to approach the approach section in writing an NIH grant. And then we'll open the floor to all of you, the participants, to ask your questions to the panelists about any issues you have around, questions you have about writing NIH grants, particularly the approach section. And then we'll allow the panelists to make a few closing remarks based on the discussions that happened previously. And then Dr. Ella August will go through a tip sheet on how to write an approach section to provide some general guidelines on writing and writing the approach section. And then Dr. David Mendez will end the call with directing you to resources we have to support your grant writing efforts. So let me now introduce our panelists. Give me just a moment to pull up my document. And we have three panelists today. Dr. Stephanie Lance. She's the program director and statistician of the Behavioral Research Program of the Tobacco Control Research Branch at NCI. Her area of focus includes tobacco use among patients in settings of cancer prevention, screening, treatment, and survivorship in particular. And before joining the NCI, Dr. Lanz was a co-founder and director of the Reduced Smoking and Exposure to Tobacco Center and a research associate professor of biostatistics at the University of Pittsburgh. We also have with us Dr. Adam Leventhal. He's director of the University of Southern California Institute for Addiction Sciences. He's professor of preventive medicine and psychology at USC, Keck School of Medicine. He directs, his research interests include adolescent and young adult substance use epidemiology, addiction in priority populations, science to inform public policy for regulating tobacco and other addictive consumer products, and cancer and cardiovascular disease prevention. Dr. Leventhal is a PI of the USC TCOR site. We also have with us Dr. Jamie Tam, who's an assistant professor of public health in the Health Policy Department at the Yale School of Public Health. Her work uses simulation or computational modeling methods to examine the domestic and international populations, issues around tobacco use disparities, with a particular attention to modeling the effects of tobacco use and tobacco policies in these populations and in among key priority populations. She works with CISNET, which is the Cancer Surveillance Network at the NIH, and she's also an investigator at the CASTOR, the T course that's housed at U of M, Georgetown, Yale, and BC Cancer. We thank all three of you for being here today and providing us with your expert advice on how to write NIH grants and provide some tips around writing the approach section. I think what we'll do now is open the floor to the panelists and allow them to give us some guidance on how to do this. So first, I'll ask Dr. Stephanie Land to share her thoughts about how you may approach the approach section.
Great. Thank you so much, Ritesh. And thanks to all the participants for being here today. I look forward to speaking with all of you. As you know, we're here to talk about developing approach sections for tobacco regulatory science proposals. And to think about this, I wanted us to start by looking at the review criteria that the peer review panels will be using to evaluate your applications, and to point out in particular that for two of the criteria, significance and innovation, there are differences between traditional NIH review criteria versus those specific to tobacco regulatory science proposals. And that is why we had the webinars that came before this one that were focused on those two topics. For approach, the criteria are unchanged. And so much of the advice you might hear about writing approach sections for any NIH grant will be helpful for writing a tobacco regulatory science grant. That said, I think today we'll give you some more specific information. And I also wanted to raise for your attention that there are simplified review criteria that are coming from NIH. While they're not expected to change the structure of your application or the specific content, it may influence how you write your application based on the way that reviewers will be conducting those peer reviews. This is for submissions after January, on or after January 25th in this coming year. Instead of having the 5 criteria that you see on the left, we will in the future have 3 factors. The first is the importance of the research. That includes both significance and innovation in a single score from 1 to 9. Factor 2 is rigor and feasibility. I wonder if reviewers will pay even more attention to feasibility because that's now explicitly almost an equal part of what they're reviewing for factor 2. And the approach will also include, the review of the approach will also include the human subjects inclusions and study timelines if your study includes a clinical trial. Again, factor 2 is scored from 1 to 9. Factor 3 is going to be handled differently. That's expertise and resources. Reviewers will decide whether those are adequate or not adequate, but they will not provide a specific score for expertise and resources. That said, they will consider that factor in the overall impact score. To get more information about the simplified review criteria, I've put a link here to the notice that is the formal notification. And there's also a webinar coming up on April 17th listed here. There's a website at the bottom of this slide that you can go to in order to register for that webinar. Honestly, if you just Google NIH simplified review criteria, you will find it. And turning now to overall comments, in terms of writing the research plan, which of course includes the approach, there is a resource at NIAID, one of the other institutes within the NIH, that provides detailed information or advice. And I'll point out that they mentioned that of the peer review criteria, the approach has had the highest correlation with overall impact score. So if you're wondering how important the approach is, that's your answer. In terms of writing it, my advice would be to provide detail, be very, very careful and consistent. Your reviewers may be tired, they may be cranky, they may be on an airplane or stressed, and make it simple for them. Make it easy, make it even a pleasure to read if you can. And I would also recommend starting early with anyone you need to involve in the study, including statisticians or others with technical expertise. Involve them in the design of the study. And I would say that as well for anyone from whom you're going to ask for a letter of support. Don't wait until late in the process to make that connection. And for all tobacco regulatory science proposal applications, responsiveness is absolutely essential. Every single aim must be responsive. You can get feedback from us, including by providing aims with a letter of intent 60 days prior to a submission due date. And closing to say, happy to discuss further. A writing grant application is like a road trip. I hope you find some joy along the way and not too many bumps in the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Land. It was great to hear about the simplified criteria that are coming up. I guess we all have to reorient ourselves a little bit as we write our grants to this new criteria. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Leventhal. Would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Useful. It's like a road trip. It's like a really long road trip that sometimes never ends, but it does. So all right. My summary of tips would be structure. I think structure is really important because a lot of times we've been writing grants and we're really like in the weeds, and we forget that someone who's reading our grant has not traveled with us through all the different iterations we've had of our grants. So therefore, if you kind of lay things out from a meta perspective, sorry, my dog, and then from there, go into kind of details on specific subsections, I think that's a good strategy. It's always good to begin with a design overview of your approach. Just remind the reviewers, I think, of the aims, and then give a big picture design, I think. And then one of the most important pieces, especially in clinical research or some observational studies, are the design considerations. And so typically there's different strategies for that. But what I usually do is I do that up front, where design considerations is when you explain that we could have gone this way or this way when we designed the study, and we ultimately decided to go this way. And then you explain why you did that. Explain, rationale. All this is really important. And then sorry, he's a puppy, he's new. The preliminary studies might be something we could discuss later, but that's a big picture overview of key things to think about.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Leventhal. Appreciate that. How about Dr. Tam? Would you like to say a few words about how to think about the approach section?
Sure. So I guess I'm on this panel as the early career person. So I think I'll try to speak to that. I think with the sort of experience I had putting together my K, the approach section was really connected to my sort of goals as a candidate and what it was that I wanted to get out of this sort of training experience. So if you're applying to maybe like a career development award or something where there's an expectation that you're going to grow and develop and become more independent, I think the way that I approached the approach section was a little bit different, because how I wrote out the approach section was like, what do I want to develop? What skills do I want to be able to, by the end of this grant period, say that I have? So the methods that I was writing for the K Award was, it was a lot of it was stuff that I still didn't quite know, because the goal of the K was to develop this skill set. So I think for career development awards, the way that you might think about the approach section, maybe for like an R grant or a U grant, maybe there's an expectation that you have to know everything, and you have to know all the methods that you're sort of describing in the approach section. But I think for a career development award, yes, you do have to know some things, but you don't have to know everything. You just have to know what it is that you want to do and what skills you want to develop. So I think that would be my sort of qualification around writing maybe a K award, K grant proposal versus a different kind of proposal. The other thing I'll echo what Adam said about structure. That is, having a very logical set of subheaders. If information is too complicated to convey in a paragraph, see if you can organize it in a table or some kind of conceptual framework that will organize and orient your viewer. I think now, having had a little bit of experience reviewing grants, I hate reading proposals with no tables or figures, or very few tables and figures, because it's all text and it's all mashed in there. I think finding ways to you need white space. You want to make this an enjoyable read for your reviewer. So organize information that could be sort of conveyed, if not through a figure or table, maybe you could have it be supplementary. Like there is some text that explains it, but then there's a table or a figure that goes along with it, so that you have so that your reader is not exhausted by trying to understand what you're trying to the points you're trying to make. Or exhausted trying to understand what methods you're using. The other thing I might suggest, and this is sort of like, you want to think about potential reviewer objections before they've had a chance to react. When you're explaining maybe why you've chosen to use a particular method, it might be worthwhile to acknowledge why you didn't choose another method. And I think that that's something that when I'm, if I'm reviewing a proposal and I read how, they decided to go about it this way, the first question that comes up for me is like, well, why didn't they go about it that way? And so that might be another thing to think about in the approach section, because your reviewer is looking for gaps and looking for the ways in which you didn't think this through. So those would be my high level guidance. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Now, I think this is the Q&A portion of the session. I think we want to devote as much time as possible to answering your questions, the participants of this session. I noticed a lot of people have their cameras off. If at all possible, it would be nice if you can turn on your camera so we can make it a little bit more of a personal environment and more of a conversation rather than the speakers talking to a blank screen. So if you can at all do that, I encourage you to turn on your cameras. And we would encourage you to ask questions. One way is to just raise your hand and I will call on the person raising their hand to ask the question. And what I'll do is I'll just start things off by warming up the room with my own question. And I think all of you touched on this a little bit, this question, but maybe you want to come back to it. I mean, I guess my question is, what are some qualities that make a great approach section relative to just a good approach section? And I think some of you talked about the structure, figures, explain why you did this and did not do that. Are there other qualities of approach sections that really make you think like, wow, these people really know what they're doing and they can get it done? Stephanie.
Yeah, I would say clarity and also thoroughness, having addressed, every single piece of what they plan to do and providing a thorough explanation of how they're going to be able to do that work. That's very well received by peer reviewers.
Great.
I can comment.
Sure.
Yeah, detail, and also don't add unnecessary stuff. So what I mean by that is, like, when you get the grants, sometimes you add extra measures, you're going to do other analyses, and so, yeah, you put that in your IRB, but because space is so precious, and you don't want to also distract the reviewer, try to be as minimalist as possible. And so I know sometimes in clinical research, we like to have a lot of baseline measures, right? So it's good to explain why. Why are you putting your participants through all of that time burden? And if you don't have a good rationale for including a lot of different types of measures, then I wouldn't mention it.
Great.
I would say that avoiding, I think you want to sort of convey technical expertise when you're describing the methods that you're using, but it's a tricky balance because you need to write for someone who's an expert and write for someone who's not. And I would say If there are ways for you to communicate the methods that you're using in more accessible language, sort of like even the most technical of methods can still be boiled down to simpler, clearer like terminology and language that if that someone who is not in that space, someone who's not like an expert in that set of methods could still understand. And so I would say I think you don't want to assume that your reviewer is necessarily an expert. So figuring out how to convey technical things in sort of like more accessible lay language, I think that's a skill that every researcher, every scientist should have. But I think that when I've read proposals that successfully do that, take something that might be very technical and communicate it that in a way that makes me feel like I understand that method, that is much more compelling to me than a proposal that goes over my head. Because and then I'm left not fully understanding the proposal. So maybe an expert knows exactly what they're doing, but if I can't understand what it is that you're doing, it makes it actually harder for the reviewer to write a good review.
And can I add like a related point? That, I mean, it's a great point, Jamie. And then sometimes there in certain subfields, we take for granted like standards, and so like if you're publishing your work in a specialty journal, you don't need to explain why you chose this measure, why you're doing this, why you're doing that. But as Jamie's pointing out, right, your reviewer who may not know that these are certain conventions, even when it gets to studies, even when it gets to discussion by the panel, hopefully it does, right, that they still have that kind of confusion that they came in to the discussion with, right? And so you just always want to avoid that. So it's if you can explain some of the basic things that you might take for granted in your subfield, that's a great thing to do.
Great advice. I know a few of you participants sent in some questions to us. It would be great if one of you could raise your hand and ask the question, or I could call on one of you to ask the question to the panelists. Anybody want to volunteer to ask their question? If you submitted it or if you did not.
Hi, I can ask a question. Hi, all. Alyssa Harlow with USC. Do the panelists have any suggestions for coming up with your conceptual model? Any thoughts on that? Is a conceptual model required? Can you ever forego it? Any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Okay. Well, yeah. Do you want to answer it first, Jamie?
I'll let you have the first go.
Okay. I was going to say so usually for conceptual models, that goes in the significance section, significance and innovation. Usually that's why I like it. I know sometimes I read some grants and they kind of put that at the beginning of their approach and I'm like, huh. And then what you can do, it's nice to have a figure. Not every grant needs to have a conceptual model. If it's an etiology grant, it probably should. And then the other thing is, you want detail, but you don't want to overwhelm people, I think, with too many arrows. So it's this hard balance, but if it's too generic, it's kind of like, come on, and then ideally when it comes to the approach, right, you have your conceptual model, each of your boxes are constructs, that you need to measure. And then each of your arrows are kind of their analyses and their associations, right, that you want those measures and those associations to be in your measure section and clearly linked to the conceptual model, and in your analytic plan and clearly linked. And you can refer back to the conceptual model. And sometimes you can put like on your arrows, you can have like a letter, A for path A, B for path B. And then if you want, you can refer the reader back and forth to say, to test path B, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that I've seen some like really successful proposals where the conceptual framework is introduced early, and then the rest of the proposal is sort of like in lockstep with that. It's like the rest of the approach feels like, oh, now we're going to move through this conceptual model, a conceptual framework in a way that really makes sense. And that way all the sort of puzzle pieces come together because you gave your reader the roadmap early on. And so as you're sort of outlining the different sections of the approach section, connecting it back to that framework. So I would say, like, if you need to introduce one, I think earlier in the application is probably better. But I don't know if this is exactly your question, but as far when I was trying to think of like some kind of like diagram of how things work in the approach section, I think for, I guess for modelers, we often have to illustrate what it is that we're trying to do graphically. And so, for example, if maybe part of aim 1 is to generate inputs that would feed into, the model that's used in aim 2. So like sometimes I think a diagram can help, but I think that I don't know how applicable that is for other sort of study designs, but I found that when trying to communicate how a model will work to a non-modeling audience, breaking it down into those pieces can help for the reader as well.
Great, thank you both. I think I saw a hand up by Jamie Hartman-Boyce. Did you want to ask the question?
Yes, I'm sorry I don't have my camera on. My battery on my laptop is about to die and my charger stopped working. So I'm trying to conserve energy. And if I disappear midway through, that's what's happening. So I'm preparing an application at the moment. And my problem, as it often is that I am over length, right? Like I have too much in there. And I'm trying to think through what to cut down and what not to cut down. And one of the things that's in there at the moment is quite a bit on like how we intend to disseminate and share the results of our research and think about pathways to impact. And I came from the UK where this was a big thing that we had to put a lot of space into in our grant applications. And I'm wondering if this is what's typical, I suppose, to include there and how much space that should be taking up.
Yeah, Stephanie.
Yeah, so I would definitely take advantage of the resource sharing plan as a place to provide detail. And although I agree with the idea of including something about dissemination in various sections in the grant application, but at least from what you're describing in the UK, my guess is that you probably don't need quite as much here. I don't see that as being quite so major a part of the grant application.
Really useful. Thank you.
I know that with, I think, California's TRDRP application process, it's more emphasized more. That is, how are you going to engage relevant communities? How are you going? And so I guess if we're talking about the TRS grant mechanism, maybe it's not as important, but there may be other grant mechanisms where that is emphasized a lot more.
So thank you, Jamie, for the question, and panelists for the responses. There was a question from Dong-Mi Lee about preliminary data. Dong-Mi Lee, would you like to ask the question? I think you are in the room. Or you were? Oh, maybe they're gone. I can ask this question for them. How much preliminary data should we include in the approach section? And how do you include preliminary information or data studies in an approach section? What are some best practices from your point of view?
Well, I'm happy to start. There's always like the mechanism, right? Like, I think yeah, Jamie was talking about K awards, right? Early career Ks, and that's, sometimes you need less preliminary data. If you're a new investigator, or whatever it's called now, early stage investigator, even for an R01, you're supposed to have less preliminary, or the threshold, the requirement is supposed to be less. However, reviewers usually seem to like preliminary data. And what I think is the difficult balance is, if you have too much preliminary data, you've already done the study. If you don't have enough preliminary data, people say it's not feasible and you're not going to find what you think, right? And so when not that like the way I do it is particularly useful, but I'll just tell you the way I do it. I don't know if it's the right way or the best way, but like when I do the preliminary data, I usually, like, when I end describing a study or a finding, I'll say this provides, evidence of a scientific premise of X, but these questions are left unanswered, right? So you can kind of like do both. So, and in terms of how much, and there's different ways to organize it. Some people, they will cite 140 papers and describe a program of research. Some people will maybe have one paragraph for 4 separate studies. If you're doing like, it may be good also at the end. Like, let's say at the beginning, your preliminary data is to show like, hey, like I've done this work before, like I can do this work, this team has done this work, but it's not necessarily directly related to your hypothesis, or your research question for the proposal that you're writing. It's good to end like with the most specific, sometimes it's a pilot study, and sometimes it's some preliminary analyses in a data set that you already have.
Great. Other comments from panelists? Do you like it if it's in one section when you read or review our proposals, or is it nice to integrate the preliminary data throughout the approach section? Sometimes it may be related to measurement issues, maybe hypothesis, preliminary data about hypothesis and the likelihood of it being supported. Sometimes about feasibility, about a specific issue around recruitment or sampling. Any thoughts about that?
I feel like it's hard for me to answer that question, because you want to put this data where it makes sense. So it depends on how the approach section is sort of unfolding. As you're talking about, if there's data relevant to aim 1, then you should talk about it around aim 1. If there's data relevant to aim 2, talk about it when you're explaining and justifying your approach in aim 2. So I don't know that I could say, preliminary data should all be upfront versus sprinkled about. I think that in most cases it's probably like sort of integrated throughout, but I think it depends on the project.
And I can say, like, I usually see it more upfront, but that makes sense, right? It depends on how people structure their approach section. Sometimes they structure it separately by aim, right? Which makes sense. And then, they go through aim 1 and each of the sub components of aim 1, if they're collecting data, participants, measures, analysis, and so on and so forth. One thing, another way to do this is, you have your preliminary data, which helps to set up a scientific premise, and you can pepper in other types of preliminary data, which maybe in my mind, I wouldn't think of them as preliminary data, but they may be, right? Like kind of what Ritesh is describing. And so, like, let's say you have your participant section and you're doing a clinical research study or a new observational study. If you say, like, in our lab or in our research group, we have a track record of working with X number of participants, and this number of participants call into our research clinic every month. That's like a little bit of preliminary data, right? And it's well placed there. And then that gives you like proof. So you can say, well, we think we're going to be able to recruit 10 patients a month. So it serves that purpose.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with what else has been said, and I would just add being really clear about the fact that you were involved in generating those preliminary data to distinguish it from the literature at large. And I've seen cases where, using, depending on the tense used and the way something is cited, it may not be coming across that this is actually work you were involved in, which is really important.
I guess I would just say something around that. The you is not just you as the PI, I think, right? It's you as the research team. So you may not be the person who is, you're writing the grant as the main writer, but your teammate on the grant may have some preliminary data that would be useful to the proposal. So you is the team, not just the writer. I just want to point that out. Let's see, Sairam Jabba. Sorry if I messed up your name. I apologize.
It's pretty good. Thank you. I just have a follow-up question here. For a KO1 or a career development grant, how much preliminary data is really expected, especially if you're venturing into a new area of research or like diverging from your current research?
Yeah, I will say that my KON, which was funded, did not have that much preliminary data. There was still data. For example, like a lot of it came from work that I'd already done. So like that is sort of this is the natural extension of, I'm going to use the data that I generated in this previous study in this other way, or this is how it informs the methods and approach. For me, because some of what I proposed to do in the KO1 was, again, I want to acquire skills in this new method that I don't have experience in. What that meant was I had to go and learn a little bit about that method, right? Maybe I'm not an expert at implementing it, but I needed to know enough that I could write about it. Or that I could say, like, as part of, there's sort of the candidate information and goals, and then there's the approach section. And so, like when they're reading it, they're also looking at all the parts together. And so, okay, maybe I don't have the skills, for example, to do cost effectiveness analysis or something like that. Or I've never, developed this type of model. I haven't run this type of analysis. So what that involved for me is like learning about that. And I literally checked out textbooks at the library to kind of get a high level overview of like how to apply this method. And then I kind of use that as the building blocks to sort of write out, these are the things that I plan to do. And even though I don't know how to do them yet, I know some of the basics. And I think that's how I sort of found a way to write about doing something that I especially if you're exploring a new topic, and that's the whole point, right? A K award is supposed to be you learning something new or branching out and becoming more independent. And so I think it's okay to not know everything, but you do have to have a plan. So I think that's the balance. But I think your question about how much preliminary data to include, I think you can use the preliminary data to sort of say, this is what I already know. This is what I'm bringing to the table. And then for the parts that I didn't know, I kind of outlined a basic table of the sort of the products or the outcomes that would potentially come out of it. So maybe I didn't have like all the specifications about what the model would look like, but I had like, these are the general pieces that fit into the larger sort of research strategy. I don't know if that was vague or helpful, but yeah, happy to elaborate further. And I don't know if you were sent copies of our approach sections. Did we already disseminate something like that, Ritesh?
We have not. I think we have some folks who are internal to Castor and external. So we have to seek permission from folks who have provided their grants to share them externally. So we haven't done that to everybody.
Yeah, and Saram, if it's helpful to you, I'd be glad to share, and you can kind of see here's the stuff I knew, here's the stuff I didn't know. And most of the preliminary data was stuff I already knew or already did.
Oh, thank
Great,
you. That helps. I'll reach out to you.
Great, Jamie. I had a related question. How important is preliminary data for folks writing R01 type grants, but they are a early stage investigator or a new investigator? I've heard over the years a little bit of controversy about that maybe new investigators or ESIs, the preliminary data piece is not as important. Is that really true? Any thoughts about that? Because I think a lot of folks writing here will be folks who are ESIs or the new investigators. Or no comment.
Well, I don't know. I think that it depends on if you want to be safe, the more you can have, the better. I do think that, and I'm not sure what the current instructions are from NIH, CSR, but there used to be instructions that, like you said, that ESIs don't need to have as much preliminary data or shouldn't be as weighted as much in the score. And then what I noticed on study section is that some reviewers would follow that and others wouldn't. And they would seem to have the same threshold of expectations for preliminary data, or like just only a slightly reduced threshold. So I think it's hard to say, but it's always a good idea if you can to have some preliminary data, or be proposing for your first R01 something that is not risky enough, or not so risky or new or innovative, which doesn't sound like it's fun, but that you need feasibility to show proof of concept, right? Because it's already in the literature.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one question. Does anybody have a question for the panelists? I guess I'll ask from the list provided. There's one question about to what extent should the approach section describe the expertise of the investigator team? I know we have the bio sketches that we can use to do that, but is it good practice to include some of that information in the approach section or somewhere else in the grant application? Stephanie.
Yes, I would say that it is good practice to sprinkle that throughout. Of course, the biosketch itself is going to provide a solid defense of the expertise of the investigator. And it'll be interesting to see how reviews change after the simplified review criteria, because part of the goal of that change was to reduce the sort of halo effect that might be around people who are at the most prominent, most well-funded institutions, and to make the field more even for others. And so the expertise of the investigator in terms of credentials may be a little bit less weighted. That said, the ability of the investigator to conduct the research is going to be critical for especially the feasibility piece of the review. And so it's still really important. And I've seen that kind of information sprinkled throughout the grant, even in the approach section.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that's all for the Q&A portion of this session. Thank you for the questions and the answers provided. We want to give each panelist maybe 1 or 2 minutes to say some closing remarks based on the questions you've heard and the responses you've heard from each other. How about we start with Jamie this time and then go with Adam and Stephanie?
Sure. So, as far as advice that I would give to maybe someone who's at an earlier stage and putting together a proposal, some people work best under stress. and sort of a short turnaround time. I'm not one of those people. And so I would say know that about yourself, and know whether you're someone who can really deliver when it's crunch time, or if you're someone who needs to spend 6 months ideating before you sort of land on what it is that you're going to do. So depending on what style you have, I think depending on what style you have, know this about yourself and then work with that. The other big tip I would suggest is create enforceable mini deadlines for yourself. So what I did when I was writing the approach section, I had mini deadlines for each aim. And I enforced this by setting up a meeting with someone more senior than me to go over the aim together. So that way you could take a section that feels really overwhelming, break it down into its smaller subcomponents, and then create a little bit of pressure for you to deliver on those components. I think that will give you a lot of time to kind of see how the pieces fit as a whole and get feedback from senior investigators on specific sections of your application.
Great advice. Thank you, Jamie. Adam.
Yeah, that's good advice. Let's see. One thing that I think I've seen senior people do is sometimes if you don't have the preliminary data, you can add a co-investigator who does have the preliminary data, or even a consultant. So that I've seen that happen, and that's useful. And then I guess a concluding remark is that for approach, there's always a desire to find what is the right study design, study measures, and whatnot. But the truth is, there is no right way to do science. And then you might get a reviewer who feels otherwise, and they like it done one way, right? And it's not the way that you did it. But if you explain your thinking, this is why I'm really big on design considerations, to say one way is to do this, and this has this strength and this weakness. Another way is to do this, which has this strength and this weaknesses. And ultimately, we decided that it's better if we do it this way. So even if I'm the reviewer who says, well, I don't like to do it that way, I always do it that way, I still will be all right, you understand both sides of the coin. And so, yeah, I can't stress enough how important it is to explain the rationale for key aspects of the design. And sometimes it's it's not just, when I say design, it can be the selection of your primary outcome measure, right? Sometimes it could even be an analytic approach. So design doesn't always mean within versus between subject, or cross-sectional, longitudinal as well. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Stephanie?
Yeah, sure. I want to, I guess, add on to some of Jamie's comments about knowing yourself and whether you prefer a crunch or prefer to have more time to think things through. And just to say that, of course, it is also this team. And so even if you prefer crunch, you probably have someone on your team who does not, who's like Jamie and me, and would actually really like to have time to think things through. And so you want to be careful about that. Give people as much notice as you can, get them involved early. And the flip side is also true. Even if you start early and you like to have plenty of time, there's going to be someone on your team who prefers to do things at the last minute. And so you unfortunately are probably going to have to, be able to adapt to that as well, as frustrating as that might be. And but then turning to a different, I guess, closing remark is I would absolutely recommend getting as many people to read your application, get feedback from senior investigators or from peers. And in addition, NIH can help. We typically, program staff like myself, we will typically read your AIMS page and give you feedback on that, but we can comment on anything. If you want to ask about your approach, preliminary data, K versus, an R, feel free, reach out, and we enjoy helping. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Stephanie, and everyone on the panel. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Ella August now. She's going to go through some tips around writing the approach section, and we'll share this version of this document with you all in a few days. Go ahead, Ella.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see the tip sheet?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we have prepared a series of tip sheets to support your grant writing activities for tobacco regulatory science focused NIH grant proposals. And you will find these in the Castor grant writing toolkit. To date, we have tip sheets on writing the specific aims, one on the innovation section, significance, and now we're adding this one on the approach section. And so we don't really have time for necessarily a deep dive into this tip sheet, but I want to make sure to give you an orientation, to orient you to the tip sheet, to help you sort of get the most out of it. And you can always take time to read through it in detail, more closely after the presentation. So, to start, I wanted to recap what we heard. It's such a wonderful activity, and I just heard such wisdom from the panelists. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and advice. I wanted to start by recapping one important thing we heard from Dr. Land earlier, that for two sections of a TRSP grant application, the innovation section and the significance section, these are not judged with standard NIH criteria. They have criteria that are specific to TRS applications. And we did break these specific criteria down in our previous panels and also on the previous tip sheets. But for the approach section of TRSP applications, there aren't any special criteria. The standard NIH criteria are used. And so along these lines, I want to emphasize that in addition, to being familiar with the sort of the standard way things are organized for TRSP applications, it's really critical that each time you write a new grant application, you carefully read and review the review criteria listed in the notice of funding opportunity, because there could be specific criteria for that opportunity. So this first section is a list of standard components to include for the approach section. And you can see that these are quite similar to the type of information that you report in a scientific publication describing your findings from a research study. They include, some of these were already mentioned, conceptual framework or model, the study design, target population, sample, inclusion, exclusion criteria, how you plan to recruit participants if you're including participants. Some of you will be using a pre-existing data set, and you should describe that data set and also provide a reference that provides background about it. You should also describe your data collection procedures and tools, variables, statistical analysis, a laboratory analysis plan if that's relevant. We had a discussion, quite a nice discussion already about preliminary data. It's a good idea to include it if you have it. And, as was discussed, this can be incorporated either as a standalone sort of subsection, or it can be integrated throughout the approach. As Drs. Tam and Leventhal said, there are different ways to organize your preliminary data, and just, think about incorporating it, wherever and however it makes sense for your study and your data. The last bullet here in the components section provides information specific to computational modeling studies. These are going to be organized a little bit differently than other types of studies. So let's see. Let me just briefly add, and we've heard this again earlier. As you write your approach, really focus on not just describing, but also justifying, to really give the readers insights on why you made the decisions and choices you did. And we heard some great advice justify why you made the choices you did, but also sort of get out front of potential critiques by describing why you decided not to use a particular method, showing you're aware of different possibilities and options, which I thought that was so smart. So in the next section here, let me just scooch this up a little bit. Guiding questions to evaluate the approach section. This is intended to help you sort of take stock of your draft and assess whether it's on track. And these are taken straight from the NIH criteria that are hot linked to at the top of the page. And this section is probably going to be most helpful to use after you've written a draft, to go back and review whether you've met these, or if you need to make some revisions, in your draft to address these points, either you and or a colleague. As Dr. Land mentioned, the more eyes on your draft, the better. They highlight the methodology and how tightly it connects to your aims. And, it's just, we heard some great suggestions from Dr. Leventhal emphasizing, the connectedness and how those connections need to be present between the methods, for example, and your aims. And to make that very, very easy to navigate and clear for your readers. This section is asking you to make sure you're thinking about potential biases and other challenges your study may be susceptible to, and to make sure, again, that you got out front of these potential biases and challenges, and make sure that you've explained to your readers, I already thought about this, and this is how I'm going to handle it. This section also prompts you to ensure you have adequate plans to address relevant variables like sex, and for studies, animal studies and human studies. Now, the last bullet makes reference to some considerations for recruiting participants for clinical research. I feel like that is a bit less common, clinical orientation in this group, but this is, again, taken right from the NIH guidelines. So those considerations are there. And again, as Ritesh had mentioned, we are looking at the public version of this tip sheet that's part of the public grant writing toolkit. For internal CASTOR team members, there's a slightly modified version that includes examples to the internal proposal examples that we have in our internal toolkit. So let's see. The next two sections here are writing tips and formatting tips. In these final two sections, again, for the internal CASTOR team members, we have examples that are linked to help make these a little bit less abstract and more concrete. But I just wanted to, again, I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but I just wanted to echo a few of the really excellent comments we heard earlier by the panelists. Dr. Tam emphasized being nice to your reader, making effective use of visuals, including plenty of white space and avoiding jargon where possible. And these things can make your document just really inviting and a lot more enjoyable to read. And Drs. Tam and Leventhal also emphasized using a logical structure and that can be accomplished really with good writing, but also with formatting, informative subheadings, including tables and figures to help orient your reader with really clear table titles and figure legends. So you can just kind of scan down and you don't have to kind of comb through the text to understand what is being presented in the tables and figures. And so I will stop there because I think I'm probably over a bit on time.
Thank you so much, Ella. And it's my fault. I didn't organize myself well enough to get this stuff done on time. I want to thank everybody for being here. I think we have Dr. Mendez just to share a couple of resources that we have, and then we'll call it a day. Okay. David, do you want to share?
Well, thank you. very much for attending the webinar. We put in the chat a couple of links that to some writing resources. Feel free to go use them. And if you have any questions, just come back to us. We'll be happy to help you. So don't forget to fill out the evaluation also for the webinar, and let us know what topics you are interested in, so we can prepare material that's going to be useful to you. Thank you so much to the panelists for the wonderful presentations and the attendants, the attendees to the webinar for giving us your time, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.